From earning just $3,000 per year as a firefighter to generating over $1 million annually in less than a decade, this is the most impressive financial transformation ever documented in personal development history. Bob Proctor didn't inherit money, didn't win the lottery, and didn't have help from millionaire investors. He simply applied a specific method that completely transformed his financial reality. But does this formula really work? Or was Bob Proctor just an isolated case of extreme luck? Leave us a comment. Do you believe it's possible for an ordinary person to multiply their income by 300 times in just a few years? The financial misery nobody saw behind the brass badge and navy blue uniform of Toronto Fire Station 19, Bob Proctor lived a reality that would have shocked anyone who saw him as a respectable civil servant. The year was 1960, and while his neighbors assumed that a firefighter's salary provided comfortable middle-class security, Bob's daily existence was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to hide a crushing financial reality. His monthly paycheck of $250 barely covered the basics of survival in a city where post-war prosperity was lifting most working families into genuine comfort. After rent, utilities, food, and transportation, Bob was left with less than $20 each month for everything else: clothing, entertainment, emergencies, or any hope of building a future beyond mere subsistence. The apartment he rented on Queen Street East was a testament to financial desperation disguised as modest living. The furniture was a collection of cast-offs and second-hand purchases, carefully arranged to create an impression of respectability when visitors stopped by. But Bob knew the truth. The television was broken and unplugged, kept only to maintain appearances, while the refrigerator often contained little more than bread, milk, and whatever inexpensive protein he could afford. Clothing presented a constant challenge that required creativity and careful planning. Bob's civilian wardrobe consisted of 2 pairs of pants, 3 shirts, and a single jacket that had to serve for all occasions, from job interviews to social gatherings. He became expert at minor repairs, stitching torn seams, replacing buttons, and finding ways to extend the life of garments that should have been replaced years earlier. The social costs of financial limitation were perhaps more painful than the material deprivations. Bob learned to decline invitations that involved spending money, developing a repertoire of plausible excuses that allowed him to maintain friendships without revealing the truth about his circumstances. When colleagues suggested going out for drinks after work, Bob would claim fatigue or prior commitments rather than admit he couldn't afford the price of a beer. Dating became an exercise in creative problem-solving. Bob would suggest walks in public parks instead of restaurants, offer to cook dinner at home rather than take women out, and find free entertainment options that allowed him to maintain the pretense of a normal social life. The constant calculation required to navigate these situations was exhausting, but the alternative, admitting to potential romantic partners that he couldn't afford basic dating activities, seemed impossibly humiliating. Perhaps the most devastating aspect of Bob's financial situation was the way it affected his relationship with his own family. When his mother invited him for Sunday dinner, Bob would eat as much as possible, knowing it might be his most substantial meal of the week. But he couldn't bring himself to explain why he was always so hungry, allowing his mother to believe that his enthusiastic appetite was simply a sign of appreciation for her cooking. The emergency fund that financial advisors recommend didn't exist in Bob's world. A broken appliance, an unexpected medical bill, or even a minor car repair could trigger a cascade of financial crisis that might take months to resolve. Bob lived in constant awareness that he was one mishap away from complete disaster, a psychological burden that colored every aspect of his daily experience. At 26 years old, Bob possessed the sobering self-awareness to calculate exactly what his decade of adult working life had produced. A rented apartment filled with other people's discarded furniture, a checking account that rarely held more than $50, and no assets of any meaningful value. The American dream of steady advancement and accumulating prosperity seemed like a cruel joke designed for people who had started with advantages Bob had never possessed. The most painful moments came late at night when Bob would sit at his small kitchen table and attempt to balance a budget that simply couldn't be balanced. No matter how he rearranged the numbers, cut expenses, or fantasized about additional income, the mathematics of his situation remained stubbornly unforgiving. He was trapped in a cycle where every dollar earned was immediately consumed by basic survival needs, leaving nothing for investment, savings, or the kind of calculated risks that might lead to better circumstances. It was during one of these midnight accounting sessions, surrounded by unpaid bills and the suffocating awareness of his own limitations, that Bob reached the conclusion that would change everything. His current trajectory wasn't just unsustainable, it was actively destroying his prospects for any kind of meaningful future. Something had to change, and that something had to be dramatic enough to break the mathematical certainty of continued financial mediocrity. The first dollar of change. The morning that would mark the beginning of Bob Proctor's financial transformation started like countless others, with the familiar anxiety of checking his bank balance and finding barely enough money to buy breakfast. But this particular morning in March 1961 carried the weight of a decision that had been building for weeks. Bob was going to quit his job as a firefighter and start a cleaning business with less than $200 to his name. The transition from steady employment to entrepreneurial uncertainty was immediate and terrifying. While his fellow firefighters were collecting their regular paychecks, Bob found himself standing in front of Woolworth's department store, trying to calculate whether he could afford the basic cleaning supplies needed to service even a single client. A mop, bucket, cleaning chemicals, and rags represented an investment that consumed nearly half of his available capital. His first potential client was Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the elderly owner of a small accounting office above a bakery on College Street. Bob had spent 3 sleepless nights rehearsing his sales pitch, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of trying to convince someone to trust their business to a man whose entire company consisted of supplies that fit in a single cardboard box. "Young man, Mrs. Patterson said, looking skeptically at Bob's makeshift presentation, "My current cleaning service charges $8 per week. They've been adequate for my needs. Why should I consider changing?" This was the moment that would define everything that followed. Bob could have competed on price, offering to clean her office for $6 or $7 and accepting the poverty-level income that such pricing would guarantee. Instead, something from his reading of Think and Grow Rich surfaced in his memory. Napoleon Hill's insistence that value, not cost, should be the foundation of any business proposition. "Mrs. Patterson," Bob replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "I'm not asking you to pay less. I'm asking you to pay $20 per week for a level of service that will make your current arrangement seem inadequate by comparison." The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted from skepticism to genuine curiosity as she processed Bob's audacious proposal. He was asking for more than double her current expense for services provided by a man with no track record and no references. $20, she repeated, as if testing the words to see if they made sense. "That's more than I pay for a month of groceries. What exactly would I be getting for such an extraordinary amount?" Bob's response came from a place deeper than his conscious preparation. He began describing a level of attention and quality that he had never actually provided, but that he could visualize with startling clarity. He spoke about daily attention to details that weekly cleaning missed, about the impression her office would make on clients, about the peace of mind that came from working in an environment that reflected professional excellence. By the time Bob finished speaking, both he and Mrs. Patterson seemed surprised by the conviction and specificity of his presentation. She agreed to a 1-month trial, writing him a check for $80, more money than Bob had ever received for a single transaction in his entire life. Walking back to his apartment that afternoon, Bob clutched the check like a talisman against all the doubt and fear that had characterized his financial life. But more important than the money itself was the revelation that had occurred during his conversation with Mrs. Patterson. He had been fundamentally undervaluing not just his services, but his entire approach to creating income. The next morning, Bob arrived at Mrs. Patterson's office at 6 a.m., 2 hours before she typically began her workday. What followed was less like cleaning and more like a form of professional artistry. Every surface was not just cleaned, but polished to a reflective shine. Every corner was attended to with the kind of detail typically reserved for surgical environments. The floor was mopped, dried and buffed until it gleamed under the fluorescent lights. But Bob didn't stop with the obvious surfaces. He cleaned the inside of wastebaskets, polished the brass nameplate on Mrs. Patterson's door, organized the magazines in the waiting area, and even cleaned the windows from both inside and outside. When Mrs. Patterson arrived at 8 a.m., she walked into an office that looked better than it had on the day she first rented it. "My goodness," she whispered, looking around in genuine amazement. "I had no idea it could look like this." The transformation wasn't just in the physical space. It was in Mrs. Patterson's entire perception of her own business. Clients who visited that week commented on the professional appearance of her office. She found herself working with greater focus and energy in an environment that reflected the quality of her services. Within 2 weeks, Mrs. Patterson had referred Bob to 3 other businesses in her building. Within a month, she had voluntarily increased his payment to $30 per week, explaining that the value he provided far exceeded their original agreement. But the most significant change was in Bob himself. For the first time in his adult life, he had discovered the intoxicating reality of being paid what he was actually worth, rather than accepting whatever others were willing to offer. The difference wasn't just mathematical. It was psychological, spiritual, and completely transformative. That single $20 weekly contract had taught Bob a lesson that would reshape his entire approach to money. The amount people were willing to pay was directly related to the value they perceived, and that perception could be influenced by the quality and presentation of the service provided. He wasn't just selling cleaning, he was selling transformation, pride, and professional image. What do you think about Bob's approach so far? Do you believe that charging premium prices for superior quality is a realistic strategy for most people? Or was Bob just lucky to find clients willing to pay more? Have you ever experienced a moment when you realized you were significantly undervaluing your own worth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The secret formula to $100,000. By the summer of 1961, Bob Proctor had discovered something that would become the foundation of his financial empire: the mathematical relationship between perceived value and pricing power. What had started as a desperate attempt to charge enough money to survive had evolved into a systematic approach to creating wealth that defied every conventional assumption about service-based businesses. His cleaning operation now included 12 commercial clients, each paying between $25 and $50 per week for services that his competitors provided for $8 to $12. The secret wasn't superior equipment or revolutionary techniques. It was Bob's growing understanding of how to position quality as an investment in business success rather than an expense to be minimized. The breakthrough came when Bob realized that his clients weren't really buying cleaning services. They were buying the confidence that their businesses would make the best possible impression on their own customers. This insight led him to develop what he privately called The transformation method, a systematic approach to each client relationship that went far beyond basic maintenance. For Dr. Marcus Weber, a dentist whose practice occupied an entire floor of a downtown Toronto medical building, Bob didn't just clean the office. He created an environment that reduced patient anxiety and enhanced the doctor's professional reputation. The waiting room magazines were arranged with mathematical precision, the floors gleamed with a mirror-like finish, and even the restrooms were maintained to hospital standards. The psychological impact on Dr. Weber's practice was immediate and measurable. Patients began commenting on the exceptional cleanliness and professional atmosphere. Referrals increased as people associated the immaculate environment with superior medical care. Within 6 months, Dr. Weber's practice had grown by 30%, and he voluntarily doubled Bob's weekly fee to $100, explaining that the cleaning service had become a crucial component of his business success. This pattern repeated across Bob's client base as he learned to identify the specific ways that exceptional maintenance could contribute to each business's core objectives. For retail stores, he focused on creating an environment that encouraged customers to linger and spend more money. For professional offices, he emphasized the kind of pristine conditions that reinforced client confidence in the services provided. But Bob's real breakthrough came when he began to understand the power of systematic visualization and goal-setting techniques that he had absorbed from Napoleon Hill's teachings. Every morning, before beginning his workday, Bob would spend 30 minutes creating detailed mental images of his business as he wanted it to become, not just in the following month or year, but as the ultimate expression of his potential. This is where Bob Proctor's story connects directly to cutting-edge neuroscience that explains his extraordinary results. What Bob was doing through his morning visualization practice was activating theta brainwaves, the same frequency associated with deep meditation, creative breakthroughs, and the kind of mental clarity that allows people to see opportunities that are invisible to ordinary consciousness. Modern research has proven that the theta state enables the brain to form new neural pathways, process information more effectively, and access creative solutions that remain hidden during normal waking consciousness. Dr. James Rivers, a neuroscientist with connections to NASA, has developed the Genius Wave, a 7-minute audio program that uses advanced brain entrainment technology to induce the same theta state that Bob Proctor achieved through years of disciplined mental practice. While Bob had to spend decades learning to access this powerful mental state naturally, the Genius Wave offers immediate access to theta activation through scientifically designed audio frequencies. For just $39, you can download the same brainwave patterns that enabled Bob's financial transformation. The program comes with a 90-day money-back guarantee, so you can experience this breakthrough technology completely risk-free. The link is in the description below. Bob's morning visualization sessions began to produce results that seemed almost supernatural in their precision and timing. He would visualize specific types of clients, particular contract values, and detailed scenarios of business expansion, and these mental images would manifest in his physical reality with startling accuracy. The first major expansion came when Bob visualized cleaning contracts for an entire office building rather than individual tenants. Within weeks, he was approached by Harold Morrison, the building manager for a 20-story downtown complex, who had been observing the exceptional quality of Bob's work in several tenant spaces. "I've been watching what you do," Morrison told Bob during their first meeting. "Every office you service looks better than the others. I want to discuss a contract for the entire building, common areas, lobbies, elevators, everything. What would something like that cost?" Bob's response reflected months of mental preparation for exactly this opportunity. Instead of calculating based on square footage or hours required, he presented a proposal based on the value that exceptional maintenance would add to the building's reputation and tenant satisfaction. The monthly contract was worth more than Bob had earned in his entire previous year as a firefighter. But the real acceleration came when Bob began applying the same visualization techniques to his business systems and growth strategies. He could see with remarkable clarity how to hire and train employees, how to expand into new markets, and how to position his company as the premium service provider in every category where they competed. By the end of 1962, Bob's annual income had exceeded $100,000, a figure that seemed impossible just 18 months earlier when he had been struggling to afford basic living expenses. But more important than the money itself was Bob's growing understanding that financial success was primarily a function of mental conditioning rather than external circumstances. The transformation from poverty to wealth had required more than just hard work or good intentions. It had demanded a complete restructuring of Bob's beliefs about what was possible, his understanding of value creation, and his willingness to position himself in the marketplace based on excellence rather than desperation. Thank you so much for staying with us this far in Bob Proctor's incredible financial journey. Your engagement means everything to us, and I promise you, the most dramatic part of this transformation story is still ahead. What you've witnessed so far is just the foundation of a wealth-building system that would eventually influence millions of people around the world. The leap to the first million, the transition from a six-figure cleaning business to millionaire status required Bob Proctor to make a mental leap that would test every principle he had learned about wealth creation. By 1965, his Toronto-based operation was generating steady profits and could have provided a comfortable upper-middle-class lifestyle for decades. But Bob's morning visualization sessions had begun to reveal possibilities that extended far beyond the limitations of a single-city service business. The decision to expand beyond Toronto's borders came during one of Bob's theta state visualization sessions. He could see with startling clarity a network of cleaning operations spanning multiple cities, each managed by individuals who shared his commitment to exceptional quality and premium pricing. But turning this vision into reality would require an investment that could destroy everything he had built if the expansion failed. Bob's first major risk was opening operations in Chicago, a market that was both larger and more competitive than Toronto. The initial investment of $200,000, nearly his entire accumulated wealth, went toward equipment, vehicles, initial marketing, and the salaries of managers who would oversee day-to-day operations, while Bob developed the systems that could be replicated in additional markets. The Chicago expansion nearly ended in disaster. The managers Bob had hired lacked his intuitive understanding of value-based pricing, and several major contracts were lost to competitors who offered inferior service at significantly lower prices. Within 6 months, the Chicago operation was losing money at a rate that threatened to bankrupt Bob's entire enterprise. The crisis forced Bob to confront a fundamental truth about wealth creation. Success at one level doesn't automatically translate to success at higher levels. The skills and strategies that had made him wealthy in Toronto were necessary, but not sufficient for building a multi-million-dollar enterprise. He needed to develop new capabilities around leadership, systems thinking, and organizational management. Bob's response to the Chicago crisis became a case study in the kind of problem-solving that separates millionaires from people who simply earn high incomes. Instead of cutting losses and retreating to the safety of his Toronto operation, he moved to Chicago for 3 months and worked directly with every employee to transfer not just techniques, but the mental attitude that made premium pricing possible. The transformation required Bob to articulate principles that he had previously applied intuitively. He developed training programs that taught employees how to identify each client's specific business objectives, how to position cleaning services as investments in professional success, and how to deliver results that exceeded expectations by margins large enough to justify premium pricing. More importantly, Bob learned to hire people who possessed the same commitment to excellence that had driven his own success. This meant rejecting candidates who viewed cleaning as menial work in favor of individuals who could understand and communicate the connection between environmental quality and business success. The turnaround in Chicago took 8 months. But when it came, the results exceeded even Bob's optimistic projections. By the end of 1966, the Chicago operation was generating more revenue than his original Toronto business, and the systems he had developed were ready for replication in additional markets. The next phase of expansion included Cleveland, Detroit, Boston, and Atlanta, each requiring significant capital investment, but following the proven model that Bob had refined through his Chicago experience. The mathematical progression was relentless. Each new market generated profits that funded expansion into additional markets, creating a compound growth effect that multiplied Bob's wealth exponentially. But the most significant development was Bob's growing understanding of the difference between earning money and building wealth. His cleaning businesses were generating substantial cash flow, but Bob began investing those profits in real estate, stock market securities, and other ventures that could appreciate independently of his direct involvement. By 1968, Bob's annual income exceeded $1 million, derived from multiple sources across multiple geographic markets. But reaching this milestone brought unexpected challenges that no amount of visualization or goal setting had prepared him to handle. The first shock was the tax implications of high-income status. Bob discovered that generating $1 million in annual income didn't translate to $1 million in disposable wealth. Federal taxes, state taxes, business taxes, and payroll obligations consumed nearly 40% of his gross income, leaving him with a net worth that, while substantial, was far less dramatic than the raw numbers suggested. The second challenge was the operational complexity of managing a geographically distributed business empire. Bob found himself traveling constantly, troubleshooting problems in different cities, and dealing with personnel issues that required his personal attention. The financial success he had achieved came at the cost of the time freedom that had been one of his original motivations for leaving steady employment. Perhaps most difficult was the psychological adjustment to wealth. Bob discovered that having money created its own forms of stress and responsibility. Employees depended on his business decisions for their livelihoods. Clients expected consistent performance across all locations. Investors and partners required regular communication and strategic planning. The simple clarity of his early entrepreneurial period, when success was measured by his ability to pay rent and buy groceries, had been replaced by complex financial structures that required professional management and constant attention. Wealth, Bob realized, was not a destination but a new set of challenges that required different skills and created different forms of pressure. The hidden price of millions. By 1970, Bob Proctor's financial empire had reached dimensions that would have seemed fantastical during his firefighter days. Annual revenues approached $5 million, generated by operations in 12 cities and employing over 300 people. His personal net worth exceeded $2 million, placing him among the wealthiest individuals in Canada and providing access to a lifestyle that most people could only imagine. But wealth at this scale brought complications that Bob had never anticipated during his years of visualization and goal setting. The first devastating surprise came in the form of an internal revenue service audit that challenged the legitimacy of several business deductions and threatened to impose penalties that could have bankrupted his entire operation. The audit revealed Bob's naivety about the sophisticated financial management required for high-net-worth individuals. What had seemed like reasonable business expenses, travel, entertainment, office equipment, were scrutinized with a level of detail that exposed gaps in his record-keeping and financial procedures. The legal fees and accounting costs required to resolve the audit consumed nearly $100,000 and months of Bob's personal attention. Even more challenging were personnel problems that seemed to multiply in direct proportion to the size of his organization. Bob discovered that managing 300 employees required skills that were completely different from the personal excellence and customer service focus that had built his initial success. Issues of embezzlement, sexual harassment, racial discrimination, and workplace safety created legal liabilities that threatened to destroy everything he had built. The most painful betrayal came from Marcus Johnson, Bob's first regional manager, and someone he had considered both a friend and a business partner. Johnson had been systematically overcharging clients and pocketing the difference, a scheme that had operated for over 2 years before being discovered during a routine audit. The financial loss was significant, but the emotional impact of being deceived by someone he trusted was devastating. "I thought I was a good judge of character," Bob confided to Linda during one of their evening conversations. "But having money seems to bring out the worst in people, both the people who work for you and the people who want to take advantage of you." The social isolation that accompanied wealth was another unexpected consequence. Bob's old friends from the fire department were uncomfortable with his success, unable to relate to his new lifestyle, and suspicious of his motivations for maintaining contact. New acquaintances often seemed more interested in his money than in him as a person, leading to a pervasive loneliness that no amount of financial success could alleviate. Family relationships became complicated in ways Bob had never anticipated. Relatives who had rarely contacted him during his struggling years suddenly began calling with requests for loans, investment opportunities, and outright gifts. The assumption seemed to be that Bob's wealth created an obligation to solve other people's financial problems, regardless of how those problems had been created. His brother Michael's request for $50,000 to save a failing restaurant created a family crisis that lasted for years. When Bob declined to provide the money, recognizing that Michael's business problems were the result of poor management rather than temporary cash flow issues, he was accused of selfishness and forgetting his roots. "You've changed, Bobby," his mother told him during a particularly difficult family gathering. "Money has made you hard. The son I raised would have helped his brother without hesitation." The accusation cut deeply because it contained an uncomfortable element of truth. Bob had changed, and not all of the changes were positive. The financial discipline and analytical thinking that had made him wealthy had also made him more cautious about emotional decisions and less willing to trust other people's judgment about their own needs. Sleep became elusive for reasons that had nothing to do with financial insecurity. Bob found himself lying awake at night, not worrying about unpaid bills, but wrestling with investment decisions, personnel problems, and strategic challenges that required his constant attention. The simple clarity of his earlier life, when problems were immediate and solutions were obvious, had been replaced by complex decisions with long-term consequences that were impossible to predict. The psychological burden of being responsible for other people's livelihoods was perhaps the most unexpected cost of his success. When economic conditions forced Bob to close his Cleveland operation, 37 people lost their jobs, including several employees who had been with the company for years. The decision was financially necessary and strategically sound, but the human impact haunted Bob for months afterward. "I never wanted to be the kind of person who destroys other people's lives for the sake of profit," he told Linda after receiving a particularly angry letter from a terminated employee. But sometimes business decisions hurt people, regardless of your intentions. The most profound realization was that money, rather than solving problems, often simply replaced one set of challenges with another. The financial insecurity that had characterized Bob's early life had been replaced by responsibilities, liabilities, and emotional burdens that were equally demanding in their own way. For brief moments, usually late at night when the weight of his responsibilities felt overwhelming, Bob would remember the simplicity of his firefighter days, the clear hierarchy, the straightforward mission, the camaraderie of shared purpose. He wondered if the trade-off had been worth it, whether the financial success he had achieved was worth the price he had paid in terms of relationships, peace of mind, and personal authenticity. Conclusion: Bob Proctor's financial transformation from $3,000 to over $1 million annually proves that extraordinary wealth creation is possible for individuals willing to fundamentally change their approach to value, pricing, and business strategy. His journey demonstrates that financial success is primarily a function of mental conditioning and strategic thinking, rather than external circumstances or inherited advantages. But his story also reveals the complex realities that accompany rapid wealth accumulation. The mathematical progression from poverty to prosperity was relatively straightforward compared to the emotional, social, and psychological adjustments required to maintain and manage substantial wealth. Bob discovered that money amplifies both opportunities and problems, creating new forms of stress and responsibility that require different skills than those needed to generate wealth in the first place. The most honest assessment of Bob Proctor's financial journey is that he achieved exactly what he visualized and worked toward. But the reality of that achievement was more complicated than his initial dreams had suggested. Wealth provided freedom from certain types of problems, while creating others that were equally challenging in their own way. Perhaps the most valuable lesson from Bob's experience is that financial success, while rewarding and empowering, is not an end in itself, but a tool that can be used to create meaning, impact, and fulfillment. Or it can become a source of isolation, anxiety, and disconnection from the values and relationships that provide genuine satisfaction. The question that Bob's story poses to each of us is not whether dramatic financial improvement is possible. His life proves that it is. But whether we are prepared for the responsibilities and challenges that accompany the achievement of our financial goals. What would you do if your income multiplied by 300 times overnight? Are you prepared not just for the benefits of wealth, but for the obligations and complexities that come with it? Leave your thoughts in the comments below about your own financial goals and whether Bob Proctor's journey inspires or concerns you. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of financial transformation, and click on the next video to discover other surprising cases of people who went from poverty to wealth.